What's good, everybody? Welcome to One Foot Down, a college fantasy football show on the Fantasy and Frames Network. I'm your host, Chris Battistel. With me, as always, is my co-host, Mike Haase. It is week 7 for college football, which means it is week 7 for college fantasy football. We are excited to get you ready for such a pivotal week in the year. We got plays and fades across the position, waiver ads that you're going to want to target. We talk about our game of the week and much, much more. Mike?
Welcome, football fanatics, to the One Foot Down podcast on the Fantasy and Frames Network. Your gridiron guides, Chris and Mike, are geared up to lead you through the thrilling world of college fantasy football. Whether we're diving into Power 5 giants or uncovering hidden gems, brace yourselves for expert insights, analysis, and daring predictions. Stay in the game. Subscribe, rate, and review. This is your 2024 source for college fantasy football dominance. Let the fantasy frenzy begin.
Michael, we had another goalpost this year end up in the river. Vanderbilt beating Alabama sent Vanderbilt into absolute chaos. They fished the goalpost out of the river, and they're going to chop it up and let fans buy a piece of it so they can pay their $100,000 fine imposed by the NCAA because of the field storm. Mike, I got to ask, brother, before I ask you how you're doing, we're going to get to a more important topic. Who is the number one team in college football right now?
Texas. Isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, at this point, it almost kind of has to be.
only through default. Yeah. Well,
exactly.
A little bit of default. Yeah. It's going to be very interesting.
It really is, man. It really is. I mean, this doesn't hurt Alabama as much as it would, last year and a couple seasons ago with only the 4 teams making the playoff. They can afford to lose this game, but it hurts, man. It hurts to lose this game. Vanderbilt, after the game, directly on the Jumbotron, played the Nick Saban quote where he said the only easy place to play in SEC football to play is in Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt goes on and beats his old team, Alabama. I mean, Vanderbilt was leading from the very start of the game, didn't look back. Diego Pavia put his team on his back and said, let's go. We've had a couple upsets this year. Is that the most surprising one of the season so far, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, very surprising, yet we've both talked about Vanderbilt. We know they can be a tough team that can rise to the occasion. We talked about different teams, Illinois, Vanderbilt. I can't remember a few of them we mentioned prior to the start of the year. Just didn't expect against a team like Alabama like that. So they held true, 52 rushes.
Yeah.
So it was like a 52.
Yeah.
So they gave a 3 average. But move it. Just move it and just keep Jalen on the sidelines for as much as you can. And he still put up, but that was later in the game when they only had 20 points at whatever point of the game. Unreal. But Vanderbilt, yeah, I love it. I mean, in a way, there's going to be a lot of.
It was exciting stuff, man, and the whole weekend in general was exciting football. But that game in its own was great to watch from beginning to end. The theatrics, the surprise no onside kick call from Alabama there when they did score at the end of the game, relying on their defense, rightfully so. Their defense is pretty stout, but relying on their defense to be able to stop Vanderbilt gaining first down after first down on the ground with Eli Stowers, our tight end pickup last week, came out over 100 yards, is the number one target for Vanderbilt and Diego Pavia. And then on top of that, Nico and the Tennessee Vols losing to Arkansas and another field storming situation there. Thoughts on that game, Mike?
Yeah, and when I turned to that game later on and you saw Nico scrambling and inaccurate and indecisive He was rolling right. He was rolling left. And I know the rush is coming. They decided we're going to keep bringing the blitz. And but he wasn't. They weren't connecting. And the receivers are good on that team. We know, but they haven't really had a great overall year as a group, really. So they're going to have to get things together and find, like, he's got to find some go-to guys. Squirrel White's had relatively quiet year too. So
yeah, and he left the game with a concussion mid-game, so they did lose that target. But he hasn't been much of a target, like you said, to begin with on the year. Seeing the, I guess you could say, young mistakes of Nico on that last drive where he scrambled out of bounds, costing his team the game. But great football all around, and we're excited to get into another great week of football. Jamie, our guy Jamie, Out of Rhythm Fantasy, make sure you go check that out. Miami Cal game was more electricity. It felt like game after game. It was just, even from the Friday game where Syracuse versus UNLV, our game of the week last week, was another game that was just nonstop momentum change for each side of the ball. Exciting stuff. Before we move on to the top performers of the week, Mike, who's your Heisman vote getter? If you had a Heisman vote, who would you give it to right now? The top three right now. Odds top three: Cameron Ward, Ashton Jeanty, and Travis Hunter.
Yeah. And Travis, Milroe is in the mix, but now that he's going to have some catching up to do again. The way he looked 2 weeks ago. I know I was on Cam Ward thinking, and they came back 3 touchdowns the last 10 minutes or whatever of the game to do that. But Cal's not whatever opponent. But as you just said those names, maybe we can't avoid Gianti anymore. Because if you just keep producing, it's hard to go run
1,000 yards, Mike. 1,000 rushing yards.
We know it's
16 rushing touchdowns in 5 games.
So they were showing the replays on the one ESPN, and they're like, on the blue field. Look at this blue field, man! I love this blue field. And then they show three of his replays of 70 yards, 65. So he was running the ball for the length. Yeah. Ridiculous. So maybe we got to talk a little bit about him. I mean, we have been, but for Heisman, I mean, if he's going to continue,
who stops him? What team stops him? He had the one game where he didn't score a rushing touchdown, but that was it. Still got over 100 yards rushing. And the fact that they were up big in that game near the end of the game, midway through the game anyway, so they didn't feature him that much. So my Heisman vote getter right now is Ashton Jeanty because of the work that he's been putting on the field. Cameron Ward's been having a great season. Travis Hunter, great season. But for me right now, it's Jeanty.
Right.
What are you going to say, Mike?
Yeah. And Milroe needs to catch up. He'll get
Milroe. Curtis Rourke too. Curtis Rourke out of Indiana he's putting up a solid resume as well. They're undefeated. Indiana. So
really like Indiana.
If he keeps it up throughout the year and two of these guys falter, one of these guys falter, he can put himself into the top 3 of Heisman vote getters. I don't know who my third would be for Heisman. Yeah, it's a mix right now. There's a lot of solid football being played, a lot of solid individual football being played with some of these guys across the college football landscape. But for me, Ashton Jeanty. And you said Mike Cam Ward?
Yeah, that's who we had talked. If he can keep that up, but if they get a scare too, they got to come down one like we did with Milroe. So if Cal would have beat them, or if they have a game where they beat them, well, those position guys producing.
I mean, maybe Cal won that game. Maybe Virginia Tech won that game, but those are situations for a different show. This is One Foot Down, a college fantasy football show, not a college conspiracy football show. So let's move on with the
There's no
the top performers of week 6, one at each position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. The top performing quarterback, Tyler Huff, Jacksonville State, 193 pass yards, 15 rush attempts, 176 rush yards, 3 rushing TDs, good for 43.32 fantasy points. The first time that we've seen him on this list. He did play against Kennesaw State, but he absolutely dominated with his legs on the season. 63 rush attempts, 445 rush yards, 5 rushing touchdowns. He's rostered in 13% of Fantrax leagues. Mike, is Tyler Huff someone we can trust on a weekly basis?
So I put him in. I think you can start him like I did with one of my picks later on for a play, but I wouldn't necessarily just jump in and fill him right in. But if you're playing 3 quarterbacks and we have all the rushing points, and depending on the matchup, what I like to do with the remainder, we were talking before the playoffs, is there 5 weeks before we have college fantasy playoffs? 5 weeks left. So, a guy like that, though, I bet you could find 2 weeks to play him. Sure. He's running the ball and find those right matchups and get him in there, of course. Yeah. Because we have a whole list of guys not performing who we get to that we thought could name Brady Cook, Garrett Green, people that you might want to start somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's 15 teams on bye this week. Absolutely, you can start Tyler Huff. He's got New Mexico State. They're double-digit favorites. Then he's got a bye. No buys the rest of the way. He's got Middle Tennessee, Liberty, Louisiana Tech, FIU, Sam Houston, and Western Kentucky. So all games where it's a possible starting situation for Tyler Tyler Huff. Top performing running back of week 6, LaQuint Allen out of Syracuse, 71 rush yards, 2 rushing TDs, 9 receptions, 58 receiving yards, 2 receiving TDs, 41.4 fantasy points in a day where Ashton Janty absolutely dominated. It was LaQuint Allen that came out on top. It featured in our game of the week last week. A lot of big performers in that game of the week last week. Haj Malik, Kyle McCord, Ricky White, LaQuint Allen. The schedule isn't great for Syracuse, but since he's a focal point of what they want to do, Mike, is he a buy, sell, or hold for you?
Yeah, I think hold and let him build on that. We're hoping for good things from him. So in that offense, and that's another team that's sneaky all the way around, no more, right? And when we talked, I know it sounds crazy. We might not want to throw the word Heisman out there for McCord, but if McCord keeps up what he's doing and can beat a couple big programs, a player like that with his pedigree and what he's doing I'm a big fan of what I was saying the year last year, and he can he can throw the football. That's what you want. Yep. And he throws all the balls. So and if you can do it on a team that's not in your supposedly in the upper, if you can do it in the middle of the pack, that'll mean something. But I think I really like LaQuint, but it's just, I'd hold. There's someone else we'll talk about tonight in the fades, and not enough consistency to be the top guy, right? Like week to week all the time, it seems. So there's not enough weeks left for us to see anymore soon.
Yeah. With Syracuse's at to in the standings, they got NC State this week, Pitt, Virginia Tech, Boston College, Cal, Connecticut, and Miami. Great possibility for them to maybe run the table. There's some very hard games in that schedule. Virginia Tech, Cal's going to push them to the limit. Miami, you know what Miami's going to do. That Miami game is college fantasy championship weekend. So there's potential for a lot of points to be produced there as well. So I'm with you. LaQuint's a buy or a hold. just because of his role in that offense. If he can see anywhere from 15 or more carries, plus 5 to 7 targets per game, the opportunity for production is going to be that much more greater for LaQuint Allen over some other boomer bust running backs. The top producing wide receiver, my wide receiver play of the week last week, Jalen Royals against Boise State, 9 receptions, 211 yards, 2 touchdowns, 37.6 fantasy points, 29 targets, over 300 yards, and 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. We are finally getting the Jalen Royals we drafted. He has a great schedule and is currently the wide receiver 16 in fantasy points per game, Mike. Over or under overall fantasy finish at the end of the year, wide receiver 5, Mike. Over or under for Jalen Royals?
He's going to be wide receiver 7.
Oh, so you got the over on that one. All right. So top 10 finish for a guy that started slow and has really come on as of late. You'll take it because of the draft capital that you spent on a player like Jalen Royals. And then, of course, the only thing I had to change on the graphic here for our top producing tight end was the amount of fantasy points that he did score. Time and time again, Harold Fannin Jr. ends up on the top performers from the previous week. 9 receptions, 135 yards, 27.7 fantasy points, 4 straight games of 135 or more yards. This time, he did it with a rushing TD, has had 3 straight games of double-digit targets. Mike, could Harold Fannin be the tight end in rookie drafts? Could he be the tight end 1 in rookie drafts if he declares?
Absolutely. If you produce like that and they can use them hybrid-wise or maybe move them where we see to wide receiver and such, I think a player like Loveland or somebody, like we know how the scouts like to like to go that route. So they might want somebody that they have set up and scouted with different variables and different metrics. But if a producer like this is a wild card that we see from Fannin on the lower, and we know they produce in the NFL, guys that are not on just on a top college team. They're not often found. Those guys will make and be fine, but the guys at the back end of college that can produce, they'll find a way.
The guy is just always open. Always open. Every time I'm turning on a Bowling Green game, when I'm field surfing and I land on Bowling Green and I'm watching them on offense, Harold Fannin Jr. is just always open. He's the separation king at the position, and he could very well be the tight end 1 in rookie drafts next year for fantasy football. No doubt, man.
And I own 0 shares.
Oh, that's not great. Not great at all, Bob.
But a Rondé Gatson.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Rondé Gatson is no slouch either. Absolute stud tight end. You kind of had to reach this past season to take Harold Fannin. If you weren't comfortable with taking a tight end early, you weren't taking Harold Fannin. You're paying dearly for it because his points per week is nearly double of the next tight end. So, the separation point of Harold Fannin and the class is great. So you're paying dearly for not picking Harold Fannin. I'm still kicking myself. I sat him in one game. I'd be undefeated in one league. I sat him versus the PSU, the Penn State game, and he went off, and I just hated myself ever since. All right. Top week 7 waiver ads for each position. We'll give you our top 4 and then some honorable mentions. Quarterback, Bryson Daly out of Army, 39% rostered. QB 6 in fantasy points per game, averaging 31.8 fantasy points per week. He's got 10 rushing touchdowns on the season. He's averaging 19 rush attempts and 120 rush yards per game. The schedule is good for the rest of the season. He's got UAB and ECU up next. Playoffs, Notre Dame, UTSA, and Navy. Mike, the service academies are balling
Awesome.
out for college fantasy managers, whether it's Navy or Army. They are doing the damn thing, brother.
It's great to see. Great for so
Wow.
I turned that on the other day. I watched 5 minutes of
Yeah.
the game, and it is great. It's great to see an undefeated, like they're going to be in the conversation with the extended playoff, that one of them, likely not both, but one might get in. And that'd be something to see if you could see. I know, our
Yeah.
Army Navy, they both play Notre Dame. Well, wouldn't it be something, get in the playoff, they play again? Like if they both happen to get in, like there'll be some
I'm starting to love this 12-team playoff, Mike. I don't know about you,
it's
but
going to be, they're going to play again. They're going to have matchups. It's going to be great. Yeah.
The theatrics so far, the storylines, the drama of it all, building up to November, December is just terrific stuff. Our running back ad for week 7, Damon Claiborne out of Wake Forest, 44% rostered. He does get Clemson this week, which isn't an overall bad matchup. Just maybe game script might not be what you want for Claiborne. Clemson allows the 70th most rushing yards against per game with 154.4 yards. But his playoff schedule is great, and he is at the top of the list for the Demon Deacons out of the backfield. He's got 51% of the team's total rush attempts. And when you erase the quarterback out of only the running backs, he has a 62%. He holds 62% of the team's total rush attempts. He's averaging 5.8 yards per carry, and he's got 12 targets on the season. Damon Claiborne is someone that you're going to be looking forward to adding for the rest of the season. Wide receiver ad, Juwan. Did I get that right? Juwan Newton, Toledo. 39% owned. He's got the University of North Carolina this week. It's a great spot to start Newton. He's the go-to for Tucker Gleason over the last 2 weeks, outpacing Junior Vander Ross, who has been the guy for the start of the season, but has kind of taken a backseat role to Newton over the last couple weeks. North Carolina allows the 14th most passing yards against per game at 290 and 326 per game over the last 3 weeks. So it's a great spot to play either Tucker Gleason, the quarterback out of Toledo, or Juwan Newton, the wide receiver. Do you own any Juwan Newton? Are you making any claims on Newton?
No.
Mike, what is the amount of fab that you would spend on a player like Newton?
Yeah, depending on, it's interesting, in a lot of the leagues we're in, the different rulings on how many pickups you can have for a year, certain weeks, different dollars. I've found it difficult, but let's just say you have $100.
Yeah, okay, let's clean it up. You got $100.
I'd go $25 or something. Like
$25. So
sure.
25% of your budget you'd put on Newton
at this point, not like the season. If you're, because it's a week. It's a weak waiver grouping, provided it's a weak waiver grouping. Big league, 12-team league.
Yeah. Anyway. I don't hate it. Maybe a little rich. I'd probably go to the teens, just because of the sample size of his role was just basically the last 2 weeks. Start of the year, it was Vander Ross. That was the lead guy. Newton's kind of taken over that role, but it's going to be interesting to see the dynamic of that, of those two pass catchers as the season goes. And then our tight end ad, our boy Eli Stowers. Last week he was our ad. This week he's our ad. 34% rostered in Fantrax leagues. He gets Kentucky this week. He's on the list again, deservingly so. The go-to for Diego Pavia and the Vanderbilt offense, 6 for 6, 113 yards this past week against Alabama. He lined up in the slot the most out of anyone in that wide receiver room for Vandy. Cannot stress how important that is to pinpointing production at the position. You kind of want to stay away from tight ends that are strictly inline guys that are mainly used to block. You want those tight ends that are either lined up out wide or lined up in the slot. If you look at Brock Bowers and where he was used at Georgia, I think 4% of his snaps, all of his snaps at Georgia, 4%, he was used as a traditional tight end. 4%.
Wow.
So if you look at Snellers' usage at Vanderbilt, it's very, very promising. He is the overall leader for the Commodores in snaps lined up out of the slot position, and he's the tight end 10 overall across all tight ends, all qualifying tight ends at least in the NCAA. So a lot of production possibility for Stowers on that offense. And if they keep getting in shootouts like they did against Alabama, which they should, because now we're in conference play, big things are going for Eli.
Agree.
Agreed? Agreed. I love when you agree, Mike. I love when you agree.
I'm agreeable.
Honorable mentions, Trey Stewart, Jacksonville State's going to be the guy out of that backfield, running back. 4 touchdowns I think he had this past weekend. He's 10% rostered across Fantrax leagues. Jaden Nixon, West Michigan running back. We touched on him last week. He was one of our waiver ads. He is a must grab, 29% rostered. It's not looking like Jalen Buckley's going to be getting that starting job back. Avery Morrows look like he's taking over that starting job in Colorado State, 11% rostered. Jaden Williams, wide receiver, Texas State, 13% rostered. Brandon Lewis, quarterback out of Nevada, pretty much the only high point of that offense for college fantasy football players is Brandon Lewis. He's 22% rostered. And another quarterback, honorable mention, Spencer Petras out of Utah, 4% rostered over the next few weeks, should put up quite a bit of production. Jamie says Aaron Anderson. Well, Jamie, we got a surprise for you, because Aaron Anderson is going to be talked about as our wide receiver play or fade, one or the other. You're going to have to stay tuned to find out. Because before we get to the wide receivers at the play and fade, Mike, we got to get to our matchup of the week. LSU versus Ole Miss. Mike, should be an absolute banger of a game.
Hopefully. Yeah. I see your question there. They're both going to be top 15. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Jackson. Now, Trey Smith's a little banged up, but he should play. And that's one wide receiver earlier in our conversation tonight. If there's a player that keeps that momentum, he's at 1,000 yards or whatever he's at pretty well. Yeah, wow, absolutely. That could be somebody that could come into play for awards. But I think your question was both on here definitely could have the top 15, because that game should be a shootout. No doubt.
Yep.
And
they're already 2 top 15 quarterbacks in fantasy scoring in Jackson Dart and Garrett Nussmeier, over 3,000 yards and 30 touchdowns combined between the two of them. Expecting a big day for both. Jackson Dart, Garrett Nussmeier. Running backs, Henry Parrish Jr. and Caden Durham, both a little banged up. Both are practicing. Parrish is averaging just over 20 fantasy points per game, and Caden Durham is averaging just over 17. Both in the top 35 of fantasy producing running backs. Both teams are in the top 30 in opponent rushing yards per game, so they're both susceptible to letting the opponent's running back run against them. Ole Miss is the third best. Oh, sorry. I got that backwards. My apologies. Both teams are good against the run. Not bad against the run. Good against the run. Ole Miss is the third best defense against the run, allowing 71 yards rushing against per game. And LSU is only allowing 63 yards rushing against per game at home. This game is in LSU. Do we trust both, or is there a guy that you are sitting between the two, Mike, knowing how good those defenses are?
Yeah, I mean, if you're deep at the position, and if we want to make that educated guess, it's going to be a shootout. You might be a game where you want to sit if the teams are good against the run like that. Parrish does seem to be getting a lot of goal line work, so I think he was a little banged up too. And I sat him this last weekend, and then he was a game time call, and was he going to dress? And then he did. and he ended up getting in the end zone. So I think, just go one if you possibly, and probably Parrish since he's been getting the lion's share there. But if it's a shootout, I think everyone else in the offense, there's stars everywhere on both sides. Tight ends, great tight ends, stud wide receivers. They got it all. So I think they're going to put on a show. So it better not be 13-10.
Better not be. So wide receiver wise is Trey Harris first. The pack is Aaron Anderson, Kyron Lacy, CJ Daniels. Trey Harris has nearly 900 yards receiving on the season. Shouldn't really be affected by the LSU pass defense, who allowed 251 pass yards against at home. Tight end room, though, you did mention Trey Harris was banged up. Lane Kiffin came out and did mention that if the game was played today, he would not be dressed. So make sure you're keeping an eye on the Trey Harris situation. The CFF week starts tomorrow. Liberty versus FIU. You have to make your decisions a little bit earlier. There's no time for lollygagging. There's no time for dilly-dallying. You have to be on the ball this week and next week and the week after that and the week after that. So it's very important that you're making the right lineup decisions, and we're hopefully going to help you with that here on One Foot Down. Tight ends, we're going to talk about one of them a little bit later in the show. Caden Price scoring for Ole Miss and Mason Taylor for LSU. Taylor is the third target on LSU, a team that is top 10 in pass attempts per game. You'll take the third target on a team that is averaging 41 pass attempts per game. The over-under is set at 64.5 with Mississippi early 2.5-point favorites. So, big game. Lots of scoring expected for LSU and Ole Miss. Mike, do you have an honorable mention? Is there another game?
Yeah, well, I looked at the list. I'm thinking like that definitely, I think you highlighted the right game. A lot of the other matchups, there are more offensive matchups this week that was defensive matchups last week, which we didn't like. So it was hard to find. And then the Miami Cal game surprised us. But, I think just checking your over-under ratings. If you got guys in those, that is a great strategy to do. If there's the top 5 games of over-under, typically they've been right as I've been following along in the gambling side of things. Most of them that they have that high are at least kind of reaching up to that ceiling. Maybe not everyone goes over. Follow that. If your players fall in line, play them. So I did try that regardless, even if they're the top player at the position. So like LSU, all 3 wide receivers, which we'll get to later, that's reminding me, or teams like Ole Miss, you can go that deep on those teams with that. Other teams you cannot. So with that high of points, but for over-under, if you're following that way to roster your team, if that makes sense, yeah,
absolutely. Let's get into the plays and fades. We're going to give you a play and fade at each position. Before we do, let's knock out these buys. There are 15 teams with the Week 7 bye: Arkansas, Auburn, Baylor, Boston College, Duke, Florida State, Houston, Indiana, Kansas, Miami, Michigan, Michigan State, Nebraska, Oklahoma State, and SMU. So some heavy hitters across the board with 15 teams on the bye. Last week it was 14. Wow. This week, 15 teams, Mike. Not a great look for fantasy managers who are trying to juggle their lineups this week. But we're going to give you some options that you should start and give you some options that you should probably consider sitting. And our first positional group is quarterback. Mike, you drew the play this week. Who you got?
Yeah, we talked about him briefly last week, and Jake Retzlaff of BYU. BYU's another surprise team that's playing very well. I think most rankings have them at 14 or 15 in the nation, and he's been steadily consistent each week. A nice surprise, and leading them, and has a lot of grit to his game. They'll be playing Arizona. And the over-under is not extreme, but it's right up at about the 50 point. So it's like, well, if they can reach that threshold and surprise us and get into 55, 56, 57, you're going to get a number of the points you need. He has 24.9 points a game on average, 61% completion, 1,200 yards he's passed for. He's only started in 5% of the time, and you're looking at one of those guys that started them for 2 weeks. Your FF Mike H, yours truly. No, anyway. Now I might have had to due to all the injuries, but he's had some, why I like him, he's had some good spike weeks of 34, 32, 28, like enough to carry you to warrant that starts. When you hover into the low 20s, like Garrett Green, Cook, who we've been talking, you have to make a decision and then sit them. And just, if they have a boom game, great. But I really like where the arrow on Retzlaff is going and how he is leading the team, how they're undefeated, how they're creating momentum. It means something for a player like that. We hope there's no hiccup. Likely to be, there'll be something, but then we'll see how he responds. So for now, ride the wave of him, rising up where he is. And they're playing Arizona, who should be, there should be points in that game. They got some offensive, good offensive caliber players on Arizona. So I think each should be fairly points. So I don't think it's going to be one of the highest spike games, but I think it'll be pretty reasonable for points or whatever.
Yeah. Jamie says it would be nice if BYU would get Chase involved a little more. He's their playmaker. I mean, yeah. Sure. But can't have it all, Jamie. All your players can't be hits, man. Come on, man. Save some hits for the rest of us.
But teams like that this year, like we said for the playoff, BYU being undefeated and Indiana are two of my favorite, and Syracuse. You can start naming these teams. Like, I do feel they're for real. Like, they're for real now. We're into where we are of the season, and competition matters, yes, but really like the momentum. It'd be interesting to see. And then, as you said, Army, Navy, there's teams. I wouldn't say they're playing above their head anymore. They're playing a good football, at this point.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And Jamie's talking about Chase Roberts there. Their wide receiver.
Right.
There, so
I don't know if he was banged up a little bit or not as well. Has he been banged up? I'm not sure.
I just don't think he just hasn't been producing like we were hoping, right?
Yeah, their other wide receiver, I think, has been banged up a bit. Who's good.
He had BYU going 6-5 on the season. Didn't expect this.
Yeah, just a surprise at this quarterback. When you and I looked, we could name 10 quarterbacks that have responded and been amazing for fantasy points. But leading teams, my other favorite who I'm starting, I keep talking about him all the time and played him against my opponent. I think we know who he is at FF Chris, and I played Eli Holstein. And he is the same as Retzlaff. He's a great year and moved over and has an opportunity, and he just keeps surprising me too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
nice. I mean,
you'll take it, man. You'll take those freebies off the waiver that come out and absolutely produce. So QB play of the week, Jake Retzlaff, BYU. QB fade of the week, Garrett Green, West Virginia. He's going up against Iowa State, and it's pretty much comes down to Iowa State's defense just being terrific this season. A big reason why they are undefeated. Garrett Green, who is the QB 30 in fantasy points per game, is going to struggle this week. We know that Garrett Green likes to use his legs. We know his strength is in his legs. Now, Iowa State hasn't been getting gashed by QBs that utilize this ability. Week 5 for Sion Chris, a player who averages 8 yards per carry and just put up 100 yards rushing against TCU, went for 6 carries, 33 yards, and no touchdowns. Week 4 versus Arkansas State, Jalen Rayner, 7 carries, 21 yards, 3 yards per carries, no touchdowns. On top of being able to cap rushing QB's fantasy potential on the ground, Iowa State allows the 5th least passing yards against per game and are only allowing 85.5 pass yards against on the road. Now, overall, Iowa State isn't the greatest defending the run. So there is going to be some hesitation of taking Garrett Green out of your lineup. They are mediocre, 47th in total rushing yards against per game. On the road, though, that number goes from 129 to 186. They go from the 47th ranked rush defense per game to the 87th ranked rush defense per game in rush yards against. So there is that room for hesitation, but to counter that, rushing QBs are only averaging 7.8 carries, 44.2 yards, and 0 touchdowns on the ground. Green just won't see the production through the air to back up a minimal output on the ground, rushing the ball. And that's why Garrett Green is my fade of the week. Michael?
Yeah, totally agree. He's been and we talked, he has all the tools there, but I just don't know the weapons around him are not enough supporting as the supporting cast. So last year he had momentum. So this is what we'll see in college. He had a lot of momentum that second half of the year. And now it's kind of gone. It fizzled.
Yeah.
We've talked about a few quarterbacks that fizzled. So I guess they can't all hit. We've learned just take your lumps.
And he's had some good weeks. He had a decent week this past week, and then a couple weeks before that, he's had a great week. But the matchup versus Iowa State is just not a spot where I want to start Garrett Green. I'd rather start Jake Retzlaff than Garrett Green this week.
Yep, and that's what I'll be putting. Definitely be playing over that matchup. So,
all right, let's get to the running backs. Our running back play this week is Delbert Mims the third. Delbert Mims the third, transfer from NC State, is having a career year at Eastern Michigan. They made him a focal point of the game plan in their last outing, carrying the ball 23 times for 145 yards and 2 touchdowns. He absolutely dominated. 10 missed tackles forced, 100-plus yards after contact. And this production wasn't propped up by a giant 75-yard run. No, his longest rush was 27 yards. So the kid absolutely put in work on the day. He has a touchdown in his last 3 games and is averaging 1 score per game across the 4 that Eastern Michigan has played. I got to preface this and say that if the starter Dante McMillan is out, because Delbert Mims has put up a lot of his production with McMillan out, Delbert Mims is an absolute fire up into your roster player. If McMillan is in, if Dante McMillan is dressed and in, you might want to consider putting Delbert Mims possibly in a flex spot or taking him out of your lineup as a whole. But McMillan wasn't able to be as productive as Mims was when it was his role in the offense. Eastern Michigan gets Miami of Ohio this week, who allows the 97th most rushing yards against per game. They have been gashed by opponents' workhorse running backs. Week 3, Corey Kiner for Cincinnati, 6 yards per carry on 21 carries, 126 yards. Week 4 against Mike's Notre Dame, mainly carried by Riley Leonard. They averaged 7.3 yards per carry, scoring 3 times on the ground. Their running back 1, Jeremiah Love, had 60 yards on 11 carries. Week 5 against Massachusetts, UMass, not a prolific running team by any means, 90th ranked team in rush yards per game, had CJ Hester go off for 63 yards on 14 carries, one of his best outputs on the year. Week 6 versus Toledo, it was nearly the same output. Toledo was averaging 4.4 yards per carry. So they are susceptible to letting running backs put in some work against them. Opponent running backs are only averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game against Miami of Ohio, but workhorse running backs, lead running backs, something Miami hasn't seen too much of, are putting up 18 fantasy points plus per week. So I am firing up Delbert Mims, especially if McMillan is out of the lineups, Mike.
Yep, like it. I don't think I own any shares as well of him, but I like how you're finding different players, like we said, of that next that can produce in the system, the team, everything they're in, maybe not in as your upper teams always have, because a lot of them aren't performing as the player I'll talk about. They're not having those years. A few are, but a few aren't. We can name several aren't. So I like when you find these players on the subsequent teams lower, different conferences too, conference matchups.
Yeah.
So I like that where you're finding them. So
Before we head to your fade, Mike, we got a little question in the chat. Individual, unrelated to college fantasy. Should I trade Aaron Jones for Joe Mixon? My brother, thank you for tuning in and dropping this question in the chat. I'm going to point you to Fantasy and Frames. Head over to @Fantasy and Frames on Twitter, or tune in to the Waiver Show tomorrow from 8 p.m. to 9:30. Fourth and Frames or Dynasty 365 on Wednesday. Those shows run from 8 to 10 p.m. They got your NFL stuff. I would be doing an injustice to you, my friend, if I tried to give you any kind of insight into Aaron Jones for Joe Mixon. I haven't been following the NFL fantasy stuff as much as I have in the past. I've been grinding out this college fantasy stuff. Again, individual, we appreciate you tuning in, man. We hope you subscribe to the channel, but make sure you tune in tomorrow, 8 o'clock, to the Fantasy and Frames Waiver Show, and they will answer all of your NFL fantasy football questions. Mike, who's the fade, brother?
Yeah, I think we mentioned earlier. So it's tough to fade Phil Maffa for Clemson, but I've drafted him in a few different leagues. Really was high on Maffa. He was getting drafted actually, on his average when we were doing the best ball leagues, Chris. If we remember, he was sneaking into the first round occasionally, even on those boards. More traditionally in the second round. But and he's a great runner, and he's probably going to go on and have a pretty decent career. He could at the next level, but the numbers are just not where we might want for fantasy points. So another one of these examples of a nice player, but the numbers aren't there if you're going to face opponents with some of these players in the other conferences that are getting more touches and scoring more often and catching more balls out of the backfield. So when I started looking up the data, his backfield catches are almost non-existent. Like I think he's caught 7 or 6,
Not great,
or something like that, and
not good
for like 20 yards maybe or something. And and you're reaching the 100-yard point a few times. That's good. That's a threshold we want, but we don't want 107 and 102 yards. Unfortunately, we'd like 172. So we're going to be greedy for fantasy points. Over 150 would be a better threshold. And he's only hit pay dirt twice, which I would have thought more. I would have thought he'd have more. So it's one of those things, 13.9 average points. You can take it in a flex if you have to do it. Absolutely. If you're filling out 6 running backs on a team, sure. So let's slot him down and find somebody different to put in, depending on the makeup of your league, that can get multiple points and catch out of the backfield and have receptions out of the backfield. The schedule sets up, Clemson plays a fairly tough schedule. And we'll get into it. And Kate Glubnik is running all over the place sometimes lately. So I think it's taken away a little bit from Maffa. So it's just one of those things. Like the player, the production could be better. 2 touchdowns, I don't think is enough. I think we can find guys that are scoring more and just fade him for now. And it may even be beyond this week, or fade him to one of your lowest flex. And that's fine, because you can't play everybody, but yeah, it's not that he's horrible for your fantasy team. He's just might not win the weeks. He's just going to sustain somewhat. Yeah.
Yeah. Who would you rather start this week, Mike? Phil Maffa or Jordan James for Oregon against Ohio State?
Oh, there's another one. I don't know if the numbers in production, Jordan, we expected him, to really shoot up.
Yeah.
That's a tough matchup against Ohio State, because if we know our numbers there, are they top 5 against the run, Chris? You might have your data there. Pretty sure they're top 10 anyway.
Yeah, top
if
15,
not top,
I want to say, but yeah.
In overall defense, they might be 3rd or 4th, which we don't know those numbers. But if they want to keep up, pretty sure they're going to be throwing the ball quite a bit, but maybe he could be useful out of the backfield. He's a better catcher out of the backfield than Maffa and some of these players. So yeah, you'd want to start that because he does both. So definitely start finding the players that are doing both.
Yeah, absolutely.
And receiving other now, even though you can have a power runner that's getting it, the points aren't adding up. Mm-hmm. They score and they run for 89 and,
yeah,
that's all you get.
Jamie says, both you guys are joining my best ball league next year. You know what, Jamie? I'm coming for you in your league this year, Jamie. I'm coming for you. Tawi would be a play for me. Yeah, Tawi Walker, Wisconsin running back with Ches Malusi leaving the program is a play. 3 touchdowns this past week. I plugged him into a few lineups, actually. Was able to snag him off of free agency. So our running back play and fades. Delbert Mims is the play out of Eastern Michigan, and the fade is Phil Maffa from Clemson. We're going to pivot to our wide receivers. And Mike, we talked a little bit about this guy, or at least touched on him at the top of the show. Your wide receiver play for week 7 is LSU's Aaron Anderson.
Yeah, I picked him off the waiver wire. I know they got a number of people to feed. Nussmeier has a number of guys to feed to get points in that offense. But as you had said this week, I thought it's a perfect opportunity with this high of an over-under and this level of competition, which should be a shootout. That's what we're hoping. But Anderson, the interesting thing I like about some of his stats are almost no incompletions go to Anderson. So that's good. If we can see an uptick of even a couple where he reaches near 10, he's getting 7 or 8 every game. His numbers are building. He's got a 98-yard game. He's got 75 yards, 78 yard. Like, I know they're spreading it out. So what I'm hoping with a player like this too is love the consistency, love that there's no incompletions. Yes, he's only scored a couple times. So this is one of my, it's not rocket science that you're guessing he's going to maybe even improve on it. You want to hit that where 1 week Nussmeier might find each week now somebody to key in on to be a go-to guy. And we know Lacey's there, but Lacey had a down week where the 1 week I don't even know, he didn't exist out there when they're double covering him. So if you can pick the right game, he's only rostered in 25% of leagues, which I find mind-boggling at that, and started 11%. So I've been starting the last 2 weeks, putting him in again, down slotting where he should be in flex. If you have 3, you better have three studs, you're hoping, in your starting 3 wide receiver positions. But he's definitely a guy you should be playing. That whole offense is playable. Depending, unless they're playing a juggernaut on defense. But 15 plus points still again on most games you're getting on him. So that higher than Maffa. Two full points higher than Phil. So that shows you, yes, he should be in the flex if we feel Phil, who's been doing fairly well, running for 100 yards. So these receivers are more advantageous to get the points. And I think I would roll with him because of that consistency, and no incompletions go to this guy. That's why I really, so if they can bump him up a couple more, 2-3 more, it'd be nice to see. Who it comes away from, I don't know, of the 3 wideouts there, but
yeah, it would probably have to be CJ Daniels at that point, or Xavier. 16.3 points, 10.5, 12.1, 8.8, 14.9 across the season, 7 targets, 8 targets, 6 targets, 6 targets, 6 targets. So he's definitely a part of what LSU wants to do offensively, at least. So I like to play with Aaron Anderson. Eli Appletoft. Great job, boys. This is Eli from Out of Rhythm. Phil Maffa from Clemson is severely underrated. He says underrated, but you're saying this week overrated, which I don't hate. I don't hate this week overrated.
Well, so we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about are we talking about the chicken or the egg? I love Maffa as a player that will, as a football player, that is going to go somewhere and probably play on Sundays. And he's running for 100 yards, which is good, but just not enough for our fantasy production, for our fantasy point production. So we're looking for it, but as a player, he's not underrated. He's going to be a runner, and he's a tough runner. They're just how they formulate their offense. He's doing the inside, the tackle work. Kate Glubnik's taking away and running on the outside and scrambling, and then he's not catching enough pass out of the backfield. So it's just like you got to get some more numbers in production. But he's great back. One of my favorites. Yeah.
He sees a high volume of carries.
Well, this hurts. Brady
yeah.
Cook is I'm sitting players this year. We've learned, as we've talked tonight, Chris, repeatedly, sitting players you have to do it if you want to win and get the fantasy points. So I'm learning to do that more often and putting guys in like Retzlaff, Holstein, the third receivers on LSU, right? Yeah. Changing the strategy a little bit. And it's been costing me, as you said, in some where if I stick to Moff, and the numbers just aren't there. And then someone plugs in somebody down lower conference and thump.
Anthony Hankerson, baby.
Yeah, Anthony Hankerson.
Jamie says Lacey a junior or a sophomore. Lacey's a senior. He's gonna be gone next year. He's NFL bound.
For sure.
So yeah. Play Aaron Anderson for LSU. Fade Denzel Boston from Washington. Denzel Boston this week draws a significant matchup against Iowa's lockdown corner in Jamari Harris, a corner who before the Ohio State game was allowing opposing wideouts to only go for 1.75 receptions, 16 yards, 7.3 yards per reception on 3.7 targets per game. This guy is the definition of lockdown. Corner against Ohio State's daunting wide receiver room, 2 targets, 1 reception, 9 yards. Now, Denzel Boston, the leader for the Washington Huskies this year, 52 targets, 35 receptions, 492 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. The go-to, like I mentioned, for what Washington wants to do through the air. Where the fade does come from, though, Washington doesn't move him around the field that much. Looking at Boston's lineup and target distribution, he is mainly the outside left wide receiver. Of his 35 receptions, 26% have come on the left side of the field. 54% have come across the middle, and only 10% of Denzel Boston's receptions this year have gone to the right side of the field. Now, this is significant because Jamari Harris doesn't leave the left side of Iowa's field when they're on defense. 100% of the snaps he's lined up on the left side. He is primarily their left corner. So with the fact that Iowa doesn't move Jamari Harris around the field too much, and Denzel Boston strictly stays on the left side of the field, or primarily stays on the left side of the field when he's lining up, he should see a lot of Jamari Harris, and that's why he is a fade for me this week. This might be the Jeremiah Hunter, Giles Jackson game for Washington this coming week against Iowa. So Denzel Boston for me is just not a great matchup. It's a matchup-based fade for me. Like I said, he probably could go out there. I don't even know if he'll see a ton of targets if he's lined up on the left side a lot. So teams just haven't been throwing to Jamari Harris's way. I was even watching the Ohio State game. There was that one pass, one of the targets that was an incompletion where he just jumped right in front of the route and almost picked it off. So teams are staying away from Jamari Harris, rightfully so. So our play is Aaron Anderson out of LSU, and our wide receiver fade is Denzel Boston, the stud wide receiver for the Washington Huskies. Let's get into the tight ends, Mike, before we wrap the show up.
Tight ends.
Not a position of glamour on the year. Caleb Johnson versus Jonah Coleman. Can't wait yet. Caleb, I mean, if Ashton Jeanty didn't exist, Caleb Johnson would be the running back one right now. But unfortunately for Caleb Johnson, Ashton Jeanty exists. There's nothing you can do about it because that kid is an absolute stud. A great show, peeps from John. Thanks for tuning in, John, man. We appreciate you tuning in. The tight end play for the week, Caden Price scoring out of Ole Miss, another highlighted player from our game of the week, a preseason target for most. Price scoring has been disappointing this season for the Rebels and fantasy managers. Week 1, though, 77 yards and a touchdown. We were all excited for what we drafted in Caden Price scoring. But in the 5 games after, he's only put up 117 yards, no touchdowns, and 8 receptions. Fear not, though, fantasy managers. It's coming this week. Price Gordon primarily lines up as a slot wide receiver, second highest snap in pass plays lined up in the slot. Out of all Mississippi wide receivers this week, Ole Miss, like we talked about at the top, draws LSU. Tight ends versus the Tigers have done pretty decently. Week 1, Lake McCree from USC had his best output for fantasy managers with over 10 fantasy points scored. Joshua Simon, South Carolina, had his best yardage day of the year in week 3. Jack Pedersen, who, you might ask? Jack Pedersen had his
JOC.
yeah, he had his best day in week 4. Even an FCS tight end out of Nichols put up 9 fantasy points in their week 2 matchup. Overall, tight ends are averaging 9.16 fantasy points per game against LSU, which isn't the sexiest number, but is good for a top 24 tight end finish in weekly scoring at the position. It's a matchup worth exploiting with the projected high amount of points that I believe we talked about a 65.5 at the top of the show for this game. I like Price scoring even more if Trey Harris does miss this game. So he should be a focal point of Ole Miss moving the ball because of LSU's lack of ability at covering the position. So Price scoring, you're firing up this week from Ole Miss. Mike, I had Garrett Green as the fade, and you got one of his targets. As a fade as well.
I know we're being hard on West Virginia, but man, we thought this offense would be it for us. And I was really high on Cole Taylor. He was getting. We talked about other guys tonight, like last year. We're fighting for those targets. If they're only he's getting 3 or 4, but last year when it was 6 or 7, like that means everything. And the average is good for like 12 yards. That's good. But if you're getting a few more targets and then scoring, that's what we want. Hence, he would be up a top 24 tight end for sure. As we just talked those numbers out, but he's not getting that chance, and he's going to be going against Iowa State, as you were saying, against the rush. They're not very good, but against the pass, they're 13th or something against the pass. I just can't see Green. I mean, Green will be scrambling, and Iowa State plays it tough. Cole's not going to have the targets. He'll probably catch a few. Maybe he has the 12-yard average for a few to move the sticks when they need to do it. But you have to go to other options if they're out there. That being said, as you're saying, those numbers, we don't all have as deep of lineups in tight end. When I notice that everybody on all of our teams we're down, that's where we let go, and we're trying to rely on a couple of players. But you're just going to have to find somebody else until he can get consistent enough in what you can get for point production, and just look somewhere else. So that's actually a fade more even for not just this week. I think it's been affected. I think it's dropped the roster in the 20s to in the teens now, about 18. I think he's getting dropped a bit. He's at about 18% roster. So I think people are reacting to that as rightly should, because those targets are down, but the player is good. That's what we're talking about tonight. He's another type of player that has a good player, not high fantasy point output. So we have to go somewhere else.
Yep. And like I touched on it with the Garrett Green breakdown. Iowa State's defense against the pass is just too good. They're allowing less than 100 yards passing against per game, and that doesn't spell good things for a pass catcher in the Mountaineers offense, and Cole Taylor is that for West Virginia. So I absolutely love the fade there, Mike. Let's just briefly touch on the players that we've talked about before we wrap up the show. Our plays and fades for week 7, a pivotal week for college fantasy managers. Please don't forget that the week starts tomorrow. Make sure you're on your P's and Q's. If you got Caden Salter on your bench because they were on the bye last week, make sure you might want to pop them in.
Good point.
But Florida International's not bad. Florida International is not a bad defense. Let's be serious here. So QBs, play Jake Retzlaff, fade Garrett Green. Running backs, play Delbert Mims, fade Phil Maffa. I just want to touch on something here. Out of the top 20 scoring fantasy running backs this week, there is 6 that are on a bye. So a player like Delbert Mims might be useful for you to come in and fill the hole if you got some of these big guys out of your lineup. Mactober, John McGlynn says there's so much visibility. I must have missed that one. I don't know what he's talking about there. Wide receivers, Aaron Anderson, Denzel Boston, and we just touched on our tight ends, Caden Price-Gorin and Cole Taylor. There's so much versatility when it comes to college football. Yeah, you can fade your first round guy and snag them out. Yeah, absolutely, man. Because the player pool is so big, you're not thrust into a position like you are with NFL fantasy, having to start. Who are you starting this week? Justin Ross? Is it you starting Justin Ross because Rashee Rice is out now? Like, who you starting in that Kansas City wide receiver room? Juju Smith-Schuster? No, what's Juju Smith-Schuster average per week fantasy scoring?
He's caught 6 balls tonight, I think.
Did he? Against my Saints? Oh, no.
For 87 yards.
Oh, my God. I don't even want to turn that game
Hold it
on.
here. Yeah.
Mike, don't tell me. I don't want to know, man. I don't want to know.
5 for 67.
Juju Smith-Schuster. Break.
Yeah. Yep. I thought he was going to end up playing for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. But anyway, right?
Yeah, you guys are jokers.
No, I'm not. Right. It's truth. You try to tell me to get more computers and more data and more technology. I got it everywhere, man. I got big screens. I got in view. I got DAZN going.
Yeah, the zone DAC.
Yeah. What's the college one? ESPN.
YouTube.
Yeah. YouTube it.
Yeah, exactly. Our waiver ads of the week: Bryson Daly out of Army, quarterback, running back Damon Claiborne, wide receiver Juwan Newton, and tight end Eli Stores. Mike, any last comments before we get out of here?
Yeah, the one thing we'll hit on, you always want something great. I think it's going to be the shootout, and Priest-Gorin and Mason Taylor both score a touchdown this weekend in that game. I know that's not major shocking. And then we're going to go in on a limb, and Aaron Anderson's getting one. Also, for LSU, I know that's not very, I should be able to do better than that. They should each throw for 500 yards or something, but yeah. Should be a high-scoring game. Better be.
I'm excited. You're excited. We're all excited because football is here, baby. Mactober is here, like John said. We are gearing up to go Tuesday. Let's go Tuesday. You ready, Mike? I'm ready.
We need one of those helmets to put on like that guy at the noon game day.
Yeah.
Got to invest in one of those helmets. I need
I need a helmet with the 2 beers on the side with the straws, man. Never mind.
Oh, well, yeah, that'd be
Guess what? Elijah Arroyo scored a touchdown last week.
I know that.
1 reception,
3 balls for 3. I think it was 3 balls for 14.
Did he get them catching 3?
3 for 14. Look at that. 4.789 average.
Fugazi, what a bum. All right, that's the show. Make sure you tune in tomorrow. We got Around the Ice, the college football betting show with JT. They're rolling. The other guys are drawing a blank right now, and the other fellas that he runs with, but they do great stuff for fantasy hockey. Around the Ice, they are running tomorrow. Hockey puck drop starts, I think, tomorrow. As a Canadian, I think I should know that, but forget about it. I don't even watch hockey. Let's get out of here, Mike. Dynasty 365 on Wednesday. Fourth and Frames on Wednesday. Shoot the Gap, the IDP show on Wednesday. And don't forget, Individual, that means you, brother. Tune in tomorrow for the weekly Waiver Wire show. They are live. They'll answer all your NFL fantasy questions. And then Sunday, I think for 3 or 4 hours straight, we are live, getting you ready for NFL game day. I'll be live at JT's house tomorrow night. Man, I mean, Mike, I don't know if, I know you're not in the Twitter streets all that much, but John, we got to get down. We got to get down to where John's at, man, because he has got a setup and a half to watch football, brother. We got to get down there, get some pops in us, some of them wobbly pops, and watch some football with John and his boys, man, because he's got a sweet setup down there, man. I think he's only in Chicago too, so it ain't that far, brother. It ain't that far.
So he's got that shed built in. Like who's the guy that has everybody in the shed and everything now? They all renovated. McAfee. Number 2. I can picture it right now, John, with everybody around. Like there's like 14 guys in there. Have you ever seen that? They're everywhere. Yeah, they're everywhere and asking questions.
I love it, man. I love it. Everywhere. I love it. We got to get down to Chicago one day, Mikey. All right, that's the show. We appreciate each and every person that tuned in to 1 Foot Down on the Fantasy and Frames Network. Please make sure you like the stream, subscribe to the channel. Oh, look at that, Mike. Look at that. Look at that. Extra bedroom available, Mike.
Wow.
Actually, we can lay head to toes, man. Head to toes.
Definitely.
Head to toes. Well, I'll be your big spoon. Floor. That's the show for Mike Haase at FF Mike H. I'm Chris Battistel. We'll see you next week. Toodles.